Hey everybody, welcome back. How you doing? I hope your studies are going smoothly. It's time for some psychology revision, and today we're going to start looking at approaches. It's going to be the cognitive approach today, and you're going to have some exam style questions on the screen. And you can pause, you can try it, you can come back, and then I'm going to break them down and talk about them. So, without further ado, let's crack on. There they are. Look, a lovely set of questions. You've got timings on the screen and everything. All right, so here's your chance. Press pause, have a go, come back, reflect afterwards. Okay, let's do it. So the first one is just state an assumption of the cognitive approach. So you don't need to explain it here. It's a nice, quick, easy mark as long as you know your stuff. Couple of assumptions, key ones for the cognitive approach. You could say that it is an information processing approach, so it's based on how we interpret information, how we store information. Yeah, some kind of brief variation of that. You could say one assumption is that behavior is influenced by schema. You could say one assumption is that the brain can be understood as being like a computer. Yeah, the computer model, computer metaphor. Yeah, so there's a few different things there. You could say that the cognitive approach assumes that we can study internal processes experimentally. You could say that the cognitive approach assumes that we can make inferences about mental processes from observations. Yeah? So you don't need to kind of go into depth there, but you do need to write a sentence just stating that assumption. Okay. For 2 marks, we now have explained the term inference. Well, we used it a minute ago as an assumption, but what is it? Well, an inference is a logical conclusion that is drawn about a behavior or a process based on what we can observe. Yeah? For example, if somebody takes longer to process a certain word or a certain color of object or something, then we might infer that maybe the cognitive processes going on were different, or maybe that the person struggled to process that piece of information. Yeah, we don't know if they struggled, but it makes sense to assume that they struggled if they took longer. Yeah, but we don't know for sure because we can't directly see what's going on inside the brain in that way. Okay, outline 2 key features. Okay. This is basically assumptions, yeah? They often use, in paper 2, they often use the term assumptions and features when you're talking about approaches, okay? But don't let that put you off. You're basically just outlining what you understand by the approach. So we've talked about lots of assumptions already. So a couple again, because we just need to outline them, so more than state them. So what could we say? One feature of the cognitive approach is the computer metaphor. 1 mark. Let's explain it. The cognitive approach assumes that the brain can be understood as being like a computer. For example, it has input, it processes, it has output. Yeah, that'll do for that 2nd mark. Another key feature of the cognitive approach is the use of the scientific method or the use of the experimental method. Cognitive psychologists, here's the outline part, cognitive psychologists often rely on controlled lab experiments in order to investigate cognitive processes. There you go, done. Just want 2 features. All right, we've got a bit of an application question here. We've got a psychology teacher running an experiment. She is showing them a picture and asking them to guess age. Okay, one group here that the picture is of a boy, the other here the word man. Unsurprisingly, you might have even done this little experiment yourselves in class. Unsurprisingly, the group who heard the picture described as a man gave a higher age. So the question, we need to refer to that and we need to outline the cognitive approach. It might seem like a bit of an odd one, but let's pick it apart. Well, in the first line, a teacher decides to run an experiment. Well, as we've mentioned, one of the key features of the cognitive approach is that cognitive psychologists rely on the scientific method. So there's a good link there, okay? So, bit of knowledge, bit of application, yeah? For example, one feature of the cognitive approach is its use of the scientific method. Psychologists often rely on controlled lab-style experiments to investigate cognitive processes. This is seen in the scenario where the teacher decides to run an experiment. The IV, for example, would be the word used to describe the picture, and then we're able to do a controlled comparison between the two conditions to investigate the effect of words or descriptions on age estimates. Okay, so there's a good 2 or 3 marks there if you're explaining that. What else could we talk about? Well, what do you think is going on here? Why have they given a higher age estimate? Perhaps you can see a way in here, because if you hear the word boy, you're activating your schema of the word boy, and what comes to mind next is that it's a young person, right? Equally, man, the schema is going to be an older person or a more mature person, yeah? So you could work in some information about schema here. So let's carry on. A further assumption or a further feature of the cognitive approach is the concept of a schema, yeah? So a schema is a mental framework or template of a concept that is developed through experience. This can be seen in the scenario when the use of the term boy or man activates participants' schema. This leads them, or this explains why the group that hear the word man gave a higher mean age estimate. Okay? You could, if you wanted an alternative or you wanted another point because you hadn't quite elaborated the previous 2 enough, you could talk about how the cognitive approach is an information processing approach. It assumes that behavior is influenced by the way that we interpret or process information. And you could then link that to the idea of hearing that word is influencing how we're processing the picture, which influences how we respond to it in terms of the age estimate. Okay, but there's plenty to talk about there. Okay. All right. Explain one limitation of the cognitive approach. Lots of ideas. I'll just give you a couple, and we'll revisit maybe a couple more when we do the bigger questions in a sec. So, one limitation of the cognitive approach to psychology is that it is largely based on inference. Yeah. Despite its controlled scientific approach, what it's trying to study are unobservable cognitive or internal processes. Because they cannot be studied directly, critics of the cognitive approach argue that it may lack internal validity, or their inferences may lack internal validity. Yeah, there's a nice limitation. What else could you say? You could say it's reductionist. So one limitation of the cognitive approach to psychology is that it's reductionist. It models the brain as being like a computer. This is known as machine reductionism, and it can therefore mean that cognitive approaches are an oversimplification of behavior. There you go, there's a couple of choices. Referring to a topic of study, okay, so they do this in approaches a fair bit. Yeah, paper 2 is quite application heavy, as I'm sure you know. So referring to a topic, discuss a strength of the cognitive approach. A couple of things to pick apart. We must refer to a topic, obviously. It's one strength, so you're only going to get marks for one. And it says discuss. So ideally we're going to develop that, possibly introduce a bit of a counter-argument. So, strengths of the cognitive approach. What you could go for, because it links to something I said a minute ago, you could go for one strength of the cognitive approach is that it uses the scientific method. Cognitive psychology has used controlled lab experiments, here comes the reference, to investigate memory. Yeah? You could mention a study if you wanted to. You could talk about, I don't know, Baddeley's encoding research. You could talk about the kind of controlled lab style studies of Peterson and Peterson when they're investigating duration. Any of those. Give an example, yeah? But memory is the topic that I'm talking about here. So I've made the point. I've given the link. I need to do a bit more here. So the use of the scientific method gives cognitive psychology validity and credibility. Yeah. Now I need to discuss it. So, despite its use of the scientific method, it largely relies on inference, and that's where I'd say what I said a minute ago in terms of it's not directly observable, and therefore maybe it doesn't have internal validity on balance. Another option, you could talk about applications. Yeah. For example, one strength of the cognitive approach is its real-world application. Cognitive psychology has led to therapies for mental health, for example, CBT for depression. There's the topic link. You could say a little bit about that. Don't go off on too much of a tangent, though. In terms of discussing that, you could say that it doesn't work for everybody, or there are alternatives such as drug therapy that also work, so the cognitive approach is maybe only a partial explanation or only has partial application to mental health. Okay, there's a couple of ideas. Right, another thing that you often see in approaches is some comparison. So that is the command word here, compare. You're not really evaluating, you're talking about similarities and differences, yeah? They might specify the other approach you have to compare it to. I've left it open here, but just be aware that they could give you a specific pair. Okay, so if, for example, we had the biological approach, how would we compare those? Well, a similarity might be that they both use the scientific method. So you're going to say the cognitive approach does this. Similarly, the biological approach does this. Yeah. A difference might be their focus on unobservable or mental processes. So the cognitive approach says this, however, the biological approach says this. Yeah. So for 6 marks for a compare question, you probably want 2 points or maybe 3 briefer ones, but I'd be happy with 2. Starting that structure like I was talking about just then. So 1 point of similarity or one similarity is this does this, this does this. Yeah. Just another quick example. If we picked, what should we do? Should we do behaviorism? Let's do behaviorism. So one similarity between the cognitive approach and the behaviorist approach is their use of the scientific method. Again, you could use that like we did with biological. You could say a similarity is their applications to treatment. Yeah, both can be combined to treat depression. Yeah, factors that, cognitive factors and behavioral factors are important. They certainly both are useful for mental health, and you could bring in the behaviorist approach to treating phobias. You could talk about flooding, yeah, as the application. Remember, you're not doing a question on flooding, but that would be the example of how the behaviorist approach also has applications to therapy. What could a difference be? Again, a bit like the biological one, I suppose, isn't it? So the cognitive is making inferences, looking at mental processes, whereas, so there's the comparative language, the behaviorist approach focuses only on externally observable behavior. It avoids inference, and it assumes that there basically is nothing important going on between the stimulus and the response. So you could do that, okay? All right. Describe and evaluate the cognitive approach. Okay, so what are the command words? Describe, so knowledge, AO1, and evaluate. So discussion, evaluation, strengths, limitations, AO3. Probably a 4+4, could be a 3+5. Doesn't really matter on the day, you just need to cover both. In terms of describing it, that's where you're talking about those key features, those key assumptions, yeah? Information processing approach. Behavior is influenced by the way we process and interpret information. Maybe mention inference, maybe mention schema, maybe mention the computer metaphor. In terms of evaluation for an 8 marker, I think 2 points is fine, yeah? Maybe a strength, maybe a limitation, maybe you could even counter-argue in one of those paragraphs if you're aiming for top marks. But I've given you lots of ideas there already for evaluation. Okay, in terms of a 16 marker, it's going to be a similar thing here. 6 knowledge marks, so obviously you want to cover all of those concepts, whereas with the 8 marker, you probably could just use maybe 2 or 3 of them. In terms of the AO3, so 10 evaluation marks here, or 10 discussion marks. We've talked about lots of evaluation ideas already, so just a very quick recap. Strength, real-world application to therapy, use of the scientific method. Limitations, things like, despite its use of the scientific method, it's based on inference, you can't directly observe a lot of what it's talking about. You could talk about level of reductionism, machine reductionism, yeah, maybe it's an oversimplification. You could, I suppose if you talk about the scientific method, you could also kind of talk about the fact that it is based on artificial research, maybe talk about ecological validity. What else could you talk about? You could talk about explanatory power, so the extent to which it can actually explain a behavior. I'm thinking about links to things like in forensic and schizophrenia. if you've studied any of those yet. So it can explain why we might see certain behaviours. If I take schizophrenia, for example, the cognitive approach can explain why an individual might have a delusion or a hallucination, but it doesn't explain where that cognitive bias comes from originally. Same thing with forensic. It might explain why someone would react aggressively. You might have come across the concept of hostile attribution bias, which is a cognitive distortion, but it doesn't explain where those distortions, where that thinking comes from. So what you might say, and hopefully this would impress an examiner, what you might say is that cognitive approaches often have proximal explanatory power. They can explain things kind of in the near, in the now, but they lack distal explanatory power. So they lack the ability to kind of explain the origins of behaviour. Okay, so there's loads and loads of ideas there. You don't need to use all of those. I think for 10 marks in a 16 marker, 3 discussion paragraphs is fine. It's about quality as well, remember. What we do need to cover here is this refer to one other approach in your response, okay? So in order to tackle that, it could be a bit of comparison. Doesn't have to be, because that's not the command word. It could just be in 1 or 2 of your discussion paragraphs. You make a reference to an alternative. So let's say you're doing an evaluation paragraph on the scientific method. You could just briefly whack in another approach that uses or doesn't use it. For example, towards the end of that discussion paragraph, it could be that you say, this is in contrast to the humanistic approach, for example, which rejects the scientific method, and arguably this means the cognitive approach is a more credible way of doing psychology. Yeah? Okay, so just some references, but you must do that to get up those levels in terms of the marking criteria. Okay, do take a moment to reflect. Even if you skip over this bit in terms of watching the video, make sure you do reflect. Yeah, how did it go? Why did it go that way? What are you going to do next? Okay, that is an important part of your learning and revision, yeah? Let this feed back, as with all of your practice and your recall attempts, let this feed back into what you do next. Okay, thanks very much, guys, especially if you're still with me. No idea how many people get this far, to be honest. Hope that was useful for you. Good luck, keep going. Remember, you got this. Bish bash bosh.